Well, good morning, class. Today is Tuesday, March the 2nd, and what a whirlwind of weather we have had. 2 weeks ago, we were coming out of an ice storm, and then this weekend, awesome, beautiful sunshine and glorious weather, and spring is beginning to spring up. Hey, I trust you guys are doing well, that you got through the difficult week of creating your papers on church and community leader interviews a week ago, and then last night getting in your reading reports on the work of the Gilbert and DeYoung book. This book, What is the Mission of the Church? I really hope you enjoyed it. I think it really was a profound book in many ways, with some good thoughts for us as we wrestle with what is the purpose of the church, how do we accomplish the purpose of the church. My hope is that that book will actually be a good springboard for you in creating your final project in our class at the end of the semester, coming up here in about 2 months, which is your major project on developing your plan for making disciples in your church ministry going forward. One of the things these guys cover well is the notions of mission and purpose, and they kind of revisit some of the things we've already talked about in terms of the Great Commission and the imperatives in the Great Commission and the Greek participles, explaining how, and then they just do a great job of unpacking that and tying it to some of the other crucial issues of our day, and that includes the issues of shalom. What does it mean to bring peace, well-being to the culture? How does that relate to the church's purpose? And then, of course, most significantly for our discussion today, they hit the subject of social justice. This is such a crucial thing when we live in an era where just this last week, the House of Representatives passed a recommendation called the Equality Act, which is going to now be taken up by the Senate and has really their finger on the pulse of our culture. What does it mean to have equality? And for us as people of faith who care about equality, what does that mean? Does this kind of legislation match up with our understanding as biblical Christians today in terms of social justice? And there are some reasons that many believers and thinkers have great pause with what is happening in our society today on the subject of social justice. A few months back, I've been on the board of trustees for Corbin for many years, almost 20 years now, and Dr. Nord gave this book to everyone on the board with his highest recommendation of reading it. The book is called Why Social Justice is Not Biblical Justice, written by a guy named Scott David Allen, who leads a disciple world impacting, disciple making ministry, and actually has a couple of students who attend Corbin. A couple of his kids attend Corbin currently. This book came out last year. This book has been the rage in online book reviews as a weighty and significant and powerful treatise, and I'm almost through it. I haven't quite finished it yet, but I want to share with you some of that as we lean in, and you'll have an assignment this week that will deal particularly with the work of social justice. So let me switch over here and show you what Scott David Allen has said in his book. He takes time to do something that DeYoung and Gilbert did not do. They struggled to define social justice. They said it's almost undefinable. It's this amorphous concept. Now, you need to realize that their book was written 10 years ago, and the whole landscape of social justice has shifted significantly in the last 10 years. And that is where Scott David Allen's book is really powerful and helpful. And here's what he says. He starts by defining the concept of biblical justice in this way. And he says, biblical justice is conformity to God's moral standard as revealed in the Ten Commandments and the royal law, which is love your neighbor as yourself. Justice is a biblical word, and we who love the Lord care about biblical justice. And then Allen goes on to break that down into two components of biblical justice. There is commutative justice, which is living in right relationship with God and others and giving people their due as image bearers of God. Commutative justice is our relationship with others, and there are just ways for us to relate to other people, recognizing that they are image bearers made in the image of God and due respect and care and love and worth and dignity because they are created in the image of God. There is a second facet of biblical justice, which is distributive justice. And that is where the scriptures talk about impartially rendering judgments. The fact that in God's economy and the way he set up the nation of Israel, that impartial judgments would be rendered, that you could go to an authority where there was jurisdiction and you could have a case settled. You could bring a complaint and it would be heard fairly, regardless of who you were or where you came from. It would be judged based on the merits of the complaint. So impartially rendering judgments, righting wrongs, meting out punishment for lawbreaking. This is all part of God's design of distributive justice. And then Allen goes on to say, this is reserved for God and God-ordained authorities. Who is responsible for this? Well, it's God and the authorities he has put in place, including parents in the home, elders in the church, teachers in the school, and civil authorities in the state. Allen compares that definition of biblical justice with a different definition, a more modern day definition of social justice. And social justice, he defines this way: deconstructing traditional systems and structures deemed to be oppressive, and redistributing power and resources from oppressors to their victims in the pursuit of equality of outcome. Now, this is a pretty poignant definition, but deconstructing traditional systems and structures that are oppressive. We live in a world where there is a massive attack going on, and we see it being played out right before our eyes, where things that have been long held cornerstones and tenets of society are now being tossed and replaced with new ways of thinking. And I think that's what he is driving at here: the traditional systems and structures deemed to be oppressive, so that in our world today, there has been a massive redefinition of things and he goes on to say, what are those traditional structures that need to be deconstructed? Well, in our world today, it's things like traditional marriage. It's like patriarchal family structure. That's not looked well upon. Traditional Judeo-Christian morality is not well looked upon. Class distinctions that have to do rooted in capitalism. There's an outcry and a turn in our culture toward a social society, socialism. And then heteronormative sexual identity. It's interesting that 10 years ago, when the book we just read was written, Social justice had everything to do with poverty and alleviating poverty and the global responsibility that we have to help the poor. But today, just 10 years later, social justice has been defined really as issues of race and class and gender and LGBT plus, and those seem to be the primary facets of the social justice outcry. And it's to that point that I'm going to ask you this week as your class participation to watch a podcast, and I will share with you the link here at the end of our time together that's going to cast some light and hopefully help us all to grow in our understanding. There's a great quote in Davis's book that says this: our primary means of transforming the world is through proclaiming the gospel. And I say, amen. That's really the thrust of what DeYoung and Gilbert wrote about. Our primary means to transform the world is through proclaiming the gospel. We must today never question the effectiveness of the gospel message as the cutting edge of positive social change. As John Stott says, evangelism is the major instrument of social change, for the gospel changes people, and changed people can change society. And I just say amen to that. We need to remember that the primary purpose of the church is to proclaim the gospel, to win lost people to Him, to grow them in their faith, and to equip them for their life of service in the church, in the community, and the world around us. And I'll close. This is my highlighted takeaway from reading in DeYoung and Gilbert. Toward the end of the book, they make what I think is a very profound statement. After discussing good works and whether we should do them or shouldn't do them and how they relate to the purpose of the church, they say this: does this mean that good deeds that aren't followed by the sharing of the gospel are somehow illegitimate or not worth doing? Of course not. They are worth doing. You can give a donation to Toys for Tots, or pick up a piece of litter in the street, or plant a tree when no one's watching, or buy someone a sandwich when you're already late to work and not say a word to them. And when you do, you will be doing a good thing, something that is motivated by your status both as a human being and more particularly as a Christian bearing fruit under the loving rule of Jesus Christ. But when you do those things, you also need to know and admit that you are not fulfilling part of the church's mission. You are not expanding the borders of the kingdom. You are not sharing the gospel without words. You are living as a human being who's been saved and regenerated by the grace of God. And who knows, maybe the next time you buy the guy a sandwich, you'll have time to explain why you're doing it in the first place. And with that, I would say I think they have done a really effective job in challenging our thinking regarding what is the purpose of the church and what is the distinction between the purpose of the church and the many good things that we do as believers that are in the realm of social justice, that are as a result of God working in our hearts and lives to care about things. I love the principle that they talk about the proximity factor, that we are more responsible the closer the proximity. And while my church may, a few months ago, my church sent a pretty large cash gift to a group in the country of Cuba that are struggling, greatly struggling under the pandemic. And we did that because we have a relationship with those people. Our church sent a team there a year ago who had worked with them. I've been going for the last 4 years doing pastor training in Cuba as an outreach on the part of Corbin and the School of Ministry. And we've built relationships, and that creates more responsibility for us there. There's also lots of poverty and pandemic effect and lack of food going on in many other countries in the world that we did not give to. And that does not make our lack of response to those matters of hunger somehow mean that we are a gospel-less and illegitimate church ministry, but it's that proximity factor that increases our responsibility. And I love how DeYoung and Gilbert wrote about that. There's a podcast that I'm going to have you watch. It's actually hosted in part by the author of this book and one of his teammates, and then two African-American pastors who are going to speak pretty powerfully to the notion of social justice and where the church comes. So your class involvement this week will be to watch this podcast. It's a little long. It's about 90 minutes, and so I want you to carve out some time and watch that. And then I'd like you to post just a response at the end in a discussion thread that I'll put up. What did you glean from it? How did it hit you? And your response there will let me know that you took part in class this week. In terms of homework, next week, you are to prepare a report on your church and community leader interviews, and that's all explained in the syllabus. But I'd like you to record for us a brief verbal report. You can use some PowerPoint slides if you want, and just tell us, what did you learn in the church and community leader interviews? And those reports need to be less than 10 minutes, and you've already done the work of writing the paper. Just tell us a little bit about what you learned and what it meant to you. So 2 things you'll work on this week: watch the podcast, post on the discussion thread a response, and then prepare a 10-minute or less report that you'll post next week showing us what you learned in the church and community leader interviews. As a side thought, you will begin reading your third text now. For this one, I've chosen a couple of pastors that have worked at creating a disciple-making ministry in their church. This book, of everything you read, is the most practical. They're going to say, here's what we've learned, and here's how we do disciple-making in the church. And they're going to lay out kind of a pathway that could be replicated. And I want you to read that over the month of March, and you'll share a reading response report at the end of the month. But I will post the link for the podcast for you to watch. God bless you guys. Enjoy the beautiful week ahead of us, and keep pressing on in learning about what it means to fulfill the church's purpose.